My name's Alexander Shelley. I'm from London, England. I'm the music director of Canada's National Arts Centre Orchestra, and I'm ready to start digging deep.
I'm Mark Sutcliffe. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books and Abacus Data. This is the latest in our series of one-on-one conversations with interesting, accomplished, thoughtful people in many different fields. Olympic champions, entrepreneurs, musicians, astronauts, television hosts, and more. We explore their stories, their challenges, the defining moments in their lives, and we learn from them all the things that we can apply to our own lives. We start off with some rapid-fire questions in part one, some questions that reveal little pieces of information about the guest, and then we start digging deep into those stories and life lessons. Our guest today has so much to share. It is Alexander Shelley. Since 2015, Alexander Shelley has been the music director of Canada's National Arts Centre Orchestra. He's originally from London, and he has conducted orchestras around the world, including as principal associate conductor of London's Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. Alexander won first prize at the 2005 Leeds Conductors Competition when he was 26 years old. He was described at the time as the most exciting and gifted young conductor to have won the award, and he has since won several other prizes for his recordings. During the coronavirus pandemic, when the orchestra was not able to perform in front of live audiences, Alexander led the orchestra through a series of live-streamed performances, sharing music with thousands and thousands of people online. By the way, Alexander is also an ambassador for a really wonderful organization with which I've recently become involved. I'm on the board of Orchestra, which is an incredible program that empowers children from underserved areas of the community using the power of music. In our very thoughtful and insightful conversation, Alexander talks about leadership, about locating his passion, how commitment leads to fulfillment, about how he recruits and inspires the members of the NAC Orchestra, which in many ways is like his team or his company. He talks about balance, self-criticism, about fate, about nuance, collaboration, planning, about the role of music in our lives. He talks about connecting with his 2-year-old son during the lockdown, and much, much more. Now, one last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear, then please subscribe to Digging Deep and post a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And also, I encourage you to share this podcast with your network. And if you're looking for more information about this episode of the show, including links to anything we reference in our discussion, we have show notes on our website. You can also read my daily blog there. I post every single day of the year. And you can subscribe to my newsletter, which is called The Weekly Dig. Every week I send out 5 very quick items that I've learned about that week. You can subscribe to that, read the blog, read the show notes, do all of that at our website, letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. And you can also find a link there to my TEDx talk. Now, let's start digging deep with Alexander Shelley. Alexander Shelley, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to Digging Deep. I really admire your work, and I've been reading a lot about how you go about what you do, and I'm really interested in exploring that with you today. I'm a fan of the NAC Orchestra, and I enjoyed a previous conversation we had very much, so I'm looking forward to this. Thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So we're going to start with some rapid-fire questions, and I want to go back to your childhood and ask you what your fondest childhood memory is.
We had a dog, and he was my father's dog, and he was like my big brother, even though I have a big brother. But he was like my big brother at home, and because my actual older brother was away at university when I was a little kid. He's considerably older than me, and it just jumps to mind when you ask me that question. Memories of kind of lying on the floor in my parents' home, cuddling our dog, because he was kind of the same size as me for most of my childhood. He was a lab and kind of big, and hearing my parents practice. They're both musicians, they're pianists, and there was always tinkling at home, coming from upstairs, coming from downstairs, coming from one of the rooms. Quite often at the same time, they were practicing different pieces. And I think the sort of cuddly nature of the dog and that sort of relationship we had, which was sort of non-verbal, we just had love between us and companionship. And then I think the warmth that music offered, knowing it was coming from my parents, knowing that they were there and hearing them play and enjoying the sound, but being cocooned in the house. I think there's a lot to unpack there for a psychologist, but
yeah,
it felt very good and warm. And that's a positive memory, I'd have to say.
That's beautiful. Who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
When I was 10 years old, it was probably my dad. Maybe still is. But I think a lot of 10-year-old kids will have their parents as heroes. And I think, the mother is the closest thing to God for a child, right? And by the time you're 10, I think, yeah, they're heroes. And dad, my mother, of course, too, but I think that goes without saying. I mean, you're one with your mother. But my father was, I think, by that point already a hero, yeah.
What did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
As long as I could really think about that question, I thought I would be a musician. I had lots of other passions and interests. I've always loved sports. I did enjoy sort of academic side of school very much, but if I had to do anything, I'd be playing an instrument or playing a sport. But yeah, music, I think, was it.
What sport?
I played soccer, I played cricket, I played tennis, and I enjoyed athletics very much. So I still am an avid runner, and it's a big part of my life. And recently I've been playing a lot of tennis again. Cricket here, not so much.
Yeah, not much cricket in Canada. What would you say your life story is in 6 words or less?
I would say happiness and search for self.
I like that.
Okay, good.
What is a big mistake you've made, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to pick out the mistake. I was just speaking to a friend and colleague last night about this, that I tend to, even though I would say I'm very much an optimist, and a sort of, I tend to just inhabit quite a positive headspace. I try to be as self-critical as possible all the time. So after every rehearsal I give and take and lead, and almost every human interaction that's not sort of mundane, I tend to reflect on sort of how I went about it. And that's what I mean by my answer to my last question, search for self. I think that even though we have sort of fundamental character traits that we do carry with us, and we're defined by experiences in our childhood, particularly. I think that search for self, that self-analysis and trying to understand one's reactions, one's behaviors is very useful. So the reason I mentioned that is that I think I'm always making little mistakes and I'm always trying to rectify them. But as regards big mistakes, I mean, I have to say I'm fortunate that there's no standout event that jumps to mind where I thought, oh, if only I had done something differently. One thing I was at a wonderful school, and it enriched me greatly, and I did a huge amount at the school, including the sports and the music. But at that particular age, between sort of 15 and 18, I think if I could relive, and this might be a mistake, if I could relive it, I would try and find the will to be more focused on study. I was naturally quite smart and quite quick, and I was a kind of like wing it person. I tended to do okay in academics without having to study hard. But I was surrounded by very brilliant people and friends and colleagues and very brilliant teachers. And I know that if I'd maybe studied a little harder at school, I could have got more out of them. It wasn't that it hindered my progress as such, but I think we all love learning. And it's only in retrospect that you realize quite what you could have learned from teachers at school sometimes. Thinking about how he'd love to live life backwards, and wouldn't it be great to go to school after living a full life and learn all these wonderful things from interesting people?
Yeah, that is a really great insight because I think when you're in school, you don't fully understand what it's all about, and it's only later that you realize what a great opportunity it was to learn, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And yeah,
For what do you feel most grateful?
I feel very grateful for a lot of things. I'm very conscious of the fact that I was born into a very loving family, um, and to two parents and to grandparents and to a circle of friends who were both able to exhibit love, but understood also, um, I think, how to give a young person space and let them make their mistakes and learn and grow. And I think I've been lucky in love from that perspective throughout my life. Loving family, loving friendships, loving wife, um, loving colleagues as well. Fate has taken me um, to places to work where I have had lovely people around me who are serious and dedicated, but also fun and kind, and no more so than the NAC. Where I work now, the colleagues I have next to me, I put my hand in fire for them.
What's been the best year of your life so far and why?
Well, it's really hard to answer that. I think weirdly, weirdly, the last year has been very special, and again, perversely, because of lockdown, I spent an uninterrupted 7 months with our little boy. My wife and I have a little son who's now 2 years and 1 month. And in the first year of his life, including the first days of his life, I was learning and studying and rehearsing and performing and running around. And it was wonderful to have him there. And I tried to grab every minute, but it was, I felt pulled apart because I could have filled a day with study. I could have filled a day with being with him. I could have filled a day with supporting my wife. And I could have filled a day, there wasn't enough time. So perversely, this time I've had since March to be at home, to be with them. And also after sort of the last, it was sort of 15 years for me, from 2005, where I won a conducting competition that kind of kicked off my career, until 2020. It's been sort of unremitting, and in a great way. A lot of doors were suddenly opened to me, and I was aware of the privilege of having those doors opened, and I tried my damnedest to do my best, but I was always rushing around, traveling a lot and working a lot. And so this time with him, but also this time, I think, going back to this earlier question of searching for self, of having time to think about what I've done, how I've done it, how I could have done it better, how I could have, all of those things to expand and broaden. That's happened in the last year. But it's very hard to feel better in life than in your early 20s, right? So if I had to just get stuck at a year, like physically, in terms of like the way I feel and stuff, the early 20s are great because you feel strong and so yeah, it's hard to
Those were
pick.
good times too. Sure. Yeah. What's been the toughest year of your life so far and why?
Well, again, this year has been very strange. I think we're getting into a Dickens quote
Yeah.
here, but it's alongside all those advantages has been the very obvious difficulty that my industry is going through, and so particularly my concern for friends, both of my generation and older, but also people starting out in the industry, has been very present, and a general concern that we all carry for what this means and the implications are. I think we all worry gravely about the economic implications of what's happening at the moment, but also the conversations that are going on in society at the moment, and some movements both to the far right and to the far left are destabilizing. I think that there's sort of powerful political, philosophical, tectonic shifts going on, and perhaps more than I would have been concerned in my early 20s. some of the language that's been throwing around and the assertions, they bother me too. So I noticed myself, perhaps because I have more time on my hands to be reading things and following things, but I noticed myself increasingly anxious about the language that's being used in debate, in inverted commas.
Yeah. What one person has had the greatest impact on your life?
Well, my wife, in the last decade and a half or two since we've known each other and been married, without question. My son, in the last year, I know everybody says this when they're a parent, and everybody who's not a parent is like, yeah, all right, whatever. But it just changes everything. It just changes everything. There's no question about it. And but before that, I would have to say my parents. I know it's again obvious. Parents define you for good, for better or for worse. And I've been very fortunate there, and they have been a wonderful guiding influence, particularly I think because I'm someone who followed them in their professional footsteps. I think that's something that maybe recurs. It happens in sports. It happens in all industries. Bankers have kids who are bankers, and politicians in Canada, for example, have kids who are politicians. But I think there is a certain understanding, a certain relationship above and beyond the normal parental relationship that occurs when you enter the same industry. You end up speaking a certain language as well together.
What would people be most surprised to learn about you?
I can run 10K in 40 minutes, maybe. I don't know. Like my wife always tells me that that's something that people wouldn't expect. But I run 10K a few times a week and have done for about 25 years, and it's like an autopilot setting. And when people ask me how fast I do it, I say, I look at the split times and I tell them, and they're like, that's really, really fast. And I don't know, I've been doing it a long time. There are people who do it a lot faster, but apparently that's a good thing that I can run it in 40 minutes.
That's great.
My knees are starting to give up, so it may be that this is the last time I can ever talk about it, the first and the last time. But otherwise, I don't know.
Well, that was a good one.
Okay.
I'm impressed. It would take me longer. If you were to give a commencement address today to a group of students, graduating students, what would the message be that you'd want to share with them?
Well, I think I did a commencement speech to a German university about a decade ago. And what I talked about there was locating your passion and trying to follow it. And I'm not sure I'd give the same speech now, because I still believe that. I still think that you can find a real particular kind of happiness if your profession is your vocation, if it's something that is deeply fulfilling to you. Then I think the whole sort of world that we live in makes more sense if you can be paid to do something you care about. So I still believe in that, but I've also spoken to so many people since then who find the concept kind of depressing, because it's so hard to enter into a profession that you really love. Let's be frank, for most people, it's a means to an end. So on the one hand, I still believe in it very much, and I'd still, say take the extra year, take the extra 2 years before you commit to something. Also in terms of higher education, I mean, it's another reason why this idea of living life backwards of Woody Allen's is a funny one, and people should look it up because the denouement at the end is brilliant. But it's you have much more of a sense, perhaps in your mid-20s or when you're at 30, of who you are and what it is you care about. And people do make sideways steps in their professions, but it's very rare. So I might talk about that. But I think something that offers me fulfillment, and it might be independent of what I do. I can't really judge because I've always done what I do, but I notice it in other things that I engage in, is a question of commitment, that one needs to learn how to learn and sort of commit to committing, and not expect good things to happen unless you can do those things. The world doesn't owe us anything, you know. It's sort of incumbent on us to, and it's exciting, right, to access as much information as we can, to absorb it, to think about things carefully, to take the time to learn, because so much has happened before that we think is new. And so many things have been written about that we think, oh, wow, you know, this is a brand new concept, and let's figure it out. No, people have been thinking about the same things for thousands of years. I mean, it's one of the reasons that the Greeks to this day, when you read them, they have so much to offer. And increasingly, you know, in our conversations nowadays, there's this sense that unless a perspective comes from a certain place that is authentic, depending on your point of view, it's not applicable to you. But so I think, you know, accessing information and learning from it, but also then this idea of diligence, of commitment, of learning a craft, whatever it is, and finding in the fulfillment of that craft, and finding in true commitment a reward in itself that frankly kind of transcends material reward. And of course, that's where the idea of sort of privilege kicks in, because that takes as a given the fact that you have enough to live on, right? And I don't mean great wealth, I just mean can you make ends meet? But if one has sort of established that for oneself, to find commitment. But I do believe that diligence, that discipline, that commitment, and craft in anything that one does will then lead to also any sort of form of material. What's the word? Well, being able to make ends meet.
Yeah.
But kind of, I hesitate to say more importantly, because there's nothing more important than people being able to simply feed themselves and house themselves. But in addition to that, I think that the personal fulfillment that one gets from, you know, serious application of personality and mind is something very beautiful, in fact, no matter what one does it in.
All right. I really appreciate you answering all of these questions, and there's so much that I want to explore from this. In just a moment, we will start digging deep with Alexander Shelley. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, but in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. Check out ZenBooks at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. Digging Deep is all about helping you make better decisions, and so is Abacus Data. Most leaders struggle to connect with and engage their audiences. Why is that? It's because they aren't sure how they think and feel and how they will react. Abacus Data can give you the strategic insights you need to make better decisions and to make them confidently. Here's a good example. A major national union was recently negotiating a new agreement for its thousands of members. This had the potential to be a very difficult process. There were many competing interests. So they brought in Abacus Data to conduct thorough and detailed research of their members to learn exactly where they stood, what they were thinking, what they wanted. And as a result, they were able to secure a strong new deal that was accepted overwhelmingly in a national vote. Abacus Data helps all of its clients understand what's really happening in the minds of their employees, clients, and stakeholders. They help them avoid costly blind spots. And they're really good at what they do. In fact, Abacus Data was one of the most accurate pollsters in the 2019 Canadian federal election. Make the one decision that will improve all of your other decisions. Let Abacus Data help you move forward with confidence and clarity. Go to abacusdata.ca. That's abacusdata.ca. So I'm going to depart from my normal list of questions here, and I'm going to ask you some questions that I saw you asking other people on the video series that you do. So mornings or evenings?
Evenings.
Okay. City or country?
I'll go for city. I don't like it when people say either or when I ask them, so I'm going to commit.
Okay, good. Solitude or social gatherings? Very interesting to see you hesitate on this one.
Why?
Well, just because I would have thought social gatherings just because you are.
Yeah, it's funny. I hesitate. I was about to say social gatherings. I love being among people, and but I think my greatest kind of development, and also my greatest source of strength, comes from solitude. So I think I should answer solitude.
Okay, very interesting. Beethoven or the Beatles?
Beethoven.
Da Vinci or Newton?
Yeah, I thought about that one too when I was asking it. It's really hard, but I think probably Da Vinci.
Okay, I like those questions. I like the way you plug them in your. I grabbed a sample of them. You have others too. People should watch your.
It's funny, when you ask me those questions, I think I probably posed them because they're things that I ask myself.
Yeah.
And for years, I was. It wasn't unwitting. It didn't take me very long to figure out why I particularly liked it. But the yin and yang sign, the circle with the two, and a whole lot of equivalents. Like the equal sign is the same thing, right? It means the same thing. It used to fascinate me, and I had to sort of dig it out of my brain why it fascinated me. And that I'd say if I had a philosophy, it would be of finding balance. So I tend not, in my view politically of the world, to be either extremely on one side or the other. I tend to be the person, if someone says black is black, I'll say, well, it could be this. Or if someone else says white is white, I say, well, it could be that. And so I tend to be the person in the room who's annoying and arguing. But I'm looking for that balance always. And I think that the sort of truth of life, if you will, exists in that area, in that area of balance. And it can be frustrating because people like dogma and people like clarity. They're like, well, you either believe this or you believe this, don't you? But when I ask solitude or social gathering or country or city or Da Vinci or Newton or Beethoven or the Beatles, there's very few people who would just simply say, oh, well, it's definitely one or the other. And that's, I think, why I ask the questions, because we all know that actually you need a bit of both. And it's very hard to think of things in life where the same doesn't hold true, that actually we're better if we're a balance.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think there is an expectation, and this applies perhaps more to public figures than to people in private conversations. But if you take a nuanced approach to something, that means you're indecisive, or that you're weak, as opposed to nuance.
I mean, firstly, that is something that has become more and more. maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's just the way life is. But I was going to say more and more prevalent in public utterances nowadays. But it drives me nuts. It drives me absolutely crazy. And frankly, I think it drives 90% of the population crazy. It's only the blowhards on Twitter, it's only a tiny percent of the Twitter users who make up most of the, they're the ones that's always sort of prevaricating, not prevaricating, the opposite, who always stating X, Y, or Z. And yeah, it's one of the things that bothers me a little bit about our time, as it does so many people. It's this constant sort of, these constant assertions. But nuance is a wonderfully beautiful thing, and to sort of bring it into a field that I actually know about rather than politics. In music, you have different people who approach it in different ways, and you will have in any given orchestra, if you take a selection of any 10 conductors, you'll have within those groups people who say, well, there's only one way to do this. You can only produce this kind of sound, and if you don't, that's a bad sound. Or you can only phrase this way, and if you don't, it's bad phrasing. And then you'll have other people who say, well, it depends on the context, it depends on this or that. And so a big part of my job is understanding that and recognizing it in other people, and understanding how to then engage and to, if necessary, and that's my personality, is to then empathize and to try and bring together. Because there's, to put it simply, having talked about nuance before, let's do it without, there's two ways to approach conducting. One is authoritarian, which is, we're doing this, X, Y, Z, take it or leave it. In fact, don't leave it, you just got to take it. And there's the other, which is that you're in front of an orchestra, and you try and figure out what the constituent parts are. You figure out, okay, there's a trumpeter who has this kind of sound, there's a flute player who has this kind of sound, there's a second violinist, the leader of the group, who does this, and another player who does that. And sometimes these are contradictory elements. If you have 60 to 100 people in an orchestra, no matter how well trained they are, it's still going to be lots of different intuitions and instincts. So when you're working as a music director, you can either seek to bring out all those, for want of a better word, idiosyncrasies, and then shape them into something that is believable. Sorry, the baby's crying in the background. It's okay. He's fine. He just woke up. He gets a bit grumpy sometimes when he wakes up.
My son was like that too. Whenever he woke up from a nap, he would start getting very upset.
Oh, really? Yeah. It's not always. It's just, I think he maybe just wants to stay asleep. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. It's also something I think about within my work. Is I prefer to bring that sort of more nuanced, listening, empathetic approach to how I work with orchestras. And the thing is that is important to establish here is not because I don't have a very strong opinion myself. And that's, I think, what you refer to, that if one is nuanced, people think that you don't stand for anything.
Yeah.
But what it is, I think, well, and I don't want to sort of malign anyone who's an authoritarian, but the thing is, it is actually more difficult personally to allow for nuance and to allow for empathy with other people. You can have a strong belief, but you say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to a rehearsal. I want us to achieve this. But the point of an orchestra is that it's a human collective, right? It's a living organism. And if you want to ignore that away and simply tell everybody exactly what to do the way you want it done, and not to respond to the organism itself, then you're going to end up with a very particular kind of music making, which is going to be kind of, again, for the want of a better word, cookie cutter. You've got any orchestra with a conductor who's an authoritarian, you'll kind of hear the same thing. Whereas I find it, also I learn a lot from it, I find it more interesting to approach each orchestra and ask myself, well, what do they offer and who are they?
I want to talk more about leading an orchestra, because I find that fascinating in a moment. But let's go back to your childhood, because I saw this picture of you playing the piano when you were an infant, and I think you were wearing this giant diaper, what you would call a nappy. Maybe you know the picture I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us about that, because you mentioned your parents were both musicians, so you were introduced to this at a very young age.
Yeah. Well, we had 5 grand pianos in my house when I was a baby.
5
grand pianos, yeah, and that was one of them. the piano was around me all the time, and I've said it before that it really was my first language, hearing music, and also hearing people communicate through music. This happens to a lot of musicians. A lot of musicians come from musical families, but you hear friends or family or parents playing chamber music, and music, if nothing, is nothing if not communication. That's what it's about. And the beautiful thing about it, or one of the many beautiful things about it, is that it is non-verbal, and that it can therefore kind of be understood by anybody, anywhere. And you cut through the meaning of words on a superficial level into this sort of essence of meaning in music. So when two musicians are communicating in a duo, they feel something that is very fundamental. It's kind of a building block of communication that we have then layered words on top of, and you know, we sort of clarify our world through words, but we also clarify emotions, and I think often, particularly those of us who are always looking for more words to describe what we're feeling and seeing, feel that words are inadequate for describing certain emotions and certain feelings and certain connections. And quite often those certain things are precisely the feelings and the connections that make consciousness and our sense of the world real. And so it can be frustrating. And I think that's why music can offer precisely that to people. It's a way of expressing exactly what you feel, but without words. And that's what the greatest composers can do. It's what the greatest improvisers can do. And I mean this across all cultures. This is not purely a Western cultural concept at all, obviously, but it's important to just restate it. I'm talking here about musics from all over the world. So yeah, anyway, I had that at home in childhood, and so it was a noisy household, that's for sure.
So what is this relationship that we have with music as human beings? Because I find that fascinating. Your son is too. I'm sure you've noticed it. I noticed it in my kids. They react to music at a very young age. They dance without anybody teaching them. You know, you can point to what it's like watching a powerful scene from a movie when they take the music out and how it just doesn't feel the same. There are a few pieces of culture which I think with which we have the same relationship as music. If you have a song or some piece of music you really enjoy, you'll listen to it multiple times. You wouldn't watch the same movie 30, 40, 50 times. You wouldn't read the same book 10 times.
Yeah.
So what is it? Why do we have this sort of innate connection with music?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I think a little bit of what I just referred to might be part of it. That if you're a musician and you're watching a movie, you're not always thinking about it, so you're not always aware of it. But if you start to think about it, you can immediately identify how a film composer, so the director through the film composer, is able to let you know what's about to happen through the music or the meaning of a moment in the film, as you mentioned. So the other night, my wife and I watched a great film from the early 90s, Clear and Present Danger. Do you remember that? It's one of the Jack Ryan movies. It was with Harrison Ford. Because we were flicking through it. Zoe, my wife, had never seen it. I said, have you seen this? She said, no. And I said, oh, it's one of my favorite films when I was, 14 or 15. So we watched it. And it's very funny. I mean, I'll mention this in a minute. What's funny is that is a film where the music really kind of underscores very literally what's about to happen. So there's this fight scene towards the end of the movie where Harrison Ford is in a kind of duel in a barn sort of factory thing, and there's a helicopter that arrives, and the helicopter is going to save them. And what happens is you've got this kind of like tense fight music going on, and then you hear a couple of French horns play a kind of lifting melody, and your gut, your soul tells you something positive's happened, and then you hear as the helicopter comes in, and you're like, oh, the helicopter's going to come and save them. And just as you register the horns and the helicopter, some trumpets like play quite kind of agitated music, and your gut tells you that is music of like an elemental, so like fighting nature. You don't think it, you feel it, and then your brain is like, oh, I think this is about to happen, and then it happens. And what the composer has done is he's juxtaposed this idea of salvation through the helicopter, and yet there's a fight continuing in the trumpets, and it happens in 4 seconds. The horn goes like that in the trumpets. Now, I was just at that point in the film, happened to be listening to the music because I found it quite interesting how they were working with the score. And I laughed and I said it to my wife, oh, you hear what they just did with the music. It's like they're just pulling at all our different strings. But I find the question fascinating too. And what a little bit like so many things in life, part of it is culturally inherited. So we have seen so many film scores over the years where a certain sweeping horn line stands for something positive, and then trumpets are martial, and trumpets have been martial for centuries, you know, and drums have been martial as well, and military for centuries. So there's culturally inherited concepts, and let's be frank, that means they are globally inherited because culture is global now. I travel to all 6 continents every year, and it's the same stuff, it's the same music, it's the same films. Whether that's good or bad, that's a whole other conversation. But at the same time, we get into chicken and egg territory. So yeah, there is no question that well, I say there's no question because studies have been done, just like with facial, smiles and frowns and things, that there are aspects of music which evolved the same independently one another all the way around the world. So they're to do with certain harmonic tensions that then resolve, and certain scales that exist for how you create melodies and things. So one's onto something there, and the studies do exist. But I think at the bottom of it, music has all types of music, whether it's pop music or jazz or Beethoven or Mahler, have the ability to express something that is fundamentally sort of true in our take on the world. And it is, I know that sounds sort of esoteric, but it's where words, I mean, again, that's another quote, where words finish, music starts. But the thing is that I believe that music can kind of hotline to aspects of our emotion and our soul and our psychology, and that's why it's so powerful. It'd be like a drug, because you could read poetry. I was going to say you can read the words of a pop song and not have the music, and it doesn't affect you as much. At the same time, there are a few things in the world that are as affecting as great poetry. So, go figure. I haven't got all the answers, I'm afraid.
Very interesting, though. So I want to talk about your role as the leader of an orchestra, because I think there are great parallels to leadership in other realms. And it has to be a very challenging role, because you are working with a group of people who excel at what they do, but you have to bring them all into unison. And there's so much less scope for anybody to stray from the plan, as it were, than there are in so many other roles. So what is your approach to leadership, and how do you, what do you apply in terms of your leadership strategy to the orchestra?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that because of the aforementioned expertise that an orchestra brings, imagine sitting in a room with 60 lawyers or 60 medics and telling them what to do, or 60 top hockey players, and working together with them. I said telling them what to do because that's the common sort of the common perspective on conductors, and to a degree its accurate degree is a misconception, or rather it's a version of the truth. But musicians who reach the level to be in a top orchestra start studying when they're 4, 5, 6, sometimes 7, 8, but it's normally single digits. People who start in double digits already, they've already got to make up quite a bit. So generally they're studying a few hours a day from their single digit years, and then they continue that on, and they go to study it, and they have their Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours behind them at a very young age. So the first thing to say is that as a conductor, you have to prepare. You need to know your stuff. Now, as with any industry, there are some people who manage to wing it. There's always going to be people who sort of fall through the gaps. They tend to be very talented, and there's the odd maestro who'll turn up who's unprepared, and people will roll their eyes, but somehow, but as a general rule, that's not going to cut it. You need to be very well prepared, and so I think it takes me back to a point that we discussed earlier on, which is this question of diligence and commitment. There's no getting around that as a conductor. If you don't know the score, if you haven't studied it very, very carefully, an orchestra will know immediately. Immediately. There is no room for just pretending or figuring it out or using clever language or whatever. If you can't hear what's wrong, if you can't hear what's right, if you can't beat correctly, if you can't, you're lost. So there's a very good weeding out mechanism there already. And part of leadership is proving competence. If you're incompetent, it's hard to lead. And this is an industry in which incompetence shows very fast. You don't have the option of saying, right, let's put in charge of the Ministry of Health someone who knows nothing about health, but they're a good manager. That's not going to work, right? You have to know what you're doing. So I mentioned that first, and I sort of emphasize it because it is fundamental to the sort of leadership role of a conductor is competence, demonstrating competence and earning trust through that competence. Now, how you demonstrate competence, or rather how you demonstrate more than competence, which is saying that you do know the score and you really have prepared diligently, but you then learn how in very efficient rehearsals to pick precisely the issues that need dealing with at the right point. That's another level, and that's another area where you gain trust. And I'd say that you have different levels on which you need to work as a music director, as a conductor coming in and doing a guest week. And maybe I should take a step back for a second for listeners, because I might be just talking gobbledygook for some people. So when you're a conductor, you build your career, and what that normally entails is being invited to conduct a concert or a set of concerts with an orchestra. So right. Some of our listeners may be Ottawa-based and know the National Arts Centre Orchestra. And when I'm not conducting the orchestra, we'll often have guest conductors in. And they'll come and do a week or sometimes 2 weeks with the orchestra, but generally it's one. And that means you go in and you have 2-3 days of rehearsals, and then you do a couple of performances. So that's sort of conducting. And then there's the music directorship role, or the chief conductor role, which is where you become you become responsible for the longer term artistic planning in the orchestra, but also then the artistic evolution of an orchestra. So it's a bit like saying you are the permanent coach of a team, and you have to have a vision for what they play like in 5 years. And then for a couple of games, a guest coach comes in, and they might try out some jazzy ideas, and it looks great and whatever, and then they leave again.
Yeah, they're gone at the end of the week.
Exactly.
It's like the guest host on Saturday Night Live, for example.
Exactly. And there might be a host who comes in and everyone's like, that guy or that gal was awesome. Let's get them back, and they should become the main coach, right? For the, that's kind of how it works. Or we never want to see them again. That was a disaster, right? So there's different things you need to think about, but primarily conducting is about competence and building trust through competence. You need to, in front of that group of very brilliant individuals who are very experienced and very knowledgeable, you need to show that you can assist them in as quickly as possible, achieving all the collective goals that you have for a performance. So the technical accuracy, intonation, all of these things, and then go the level beyond, which is to to help them in the short time you have to prepare scores and in rehearsal, to elevate beyond that, ideally, which is to say, not only do we play the piece very well technically, but we are starting to really connect with what the piece is expressing. And that could be in an abstract sense. It could be in a literal sense that, this telling a story and we want to tell this story in this way. But often it's a question of them moving into that realm of inspiration, and trying to figure out how to elicit inspiration in people. And it's an almost unquantifiable or intangible thing. People sort of know when they feel inspired, and an orchestra senses something's happening here. And people know when it's been very good, but not quite inspired. And I think audiences tend to sense that too. But so you have sort of layers of what you need to achieve, and reaching that inspiration is there. But, and sorry, it's a long-winded answer. You've got all that stuff, which is the conducting stuff. But then if you're a music director and you're working longer term, there's also whole other areas of trust. It's about what kind of music are we playing? Are we hiring the strongest players to be in the orchestra? Are we keeping an eye on players who are having a difficult time at the moment, and helping to support them and make them better? And if, frankly, if we have problems in the orchestra, if there's a weak player or two, what are we doing to solve that longer term? There's the connection with patrons. There's the connection with donors and supporters. There's connection with the city and then the state, and then there's the connection with record companies, and then international touring and venues, with composers, building the profile of the orchestra. So there's all that stuff as well. Yeah.
Have you learned some practical lessons about leadership and about managing personalities and egos and the kinds of things that the leaders of all organizations have to consider?
Yeah, I learn every day, and I've been through, plenty of highs and lows over the years. I was music director in Nuremberg for nearly a decade of the symphony orchestra there, and we had many highs, but we had lows as well, and some very, very sort of difficult days. And the nature of conducting is such that you're all working together in real time every day for 6-7 hours, and frictions can come to the fore in a way that in an office it's very different, where people are physically separated, especially nowadays. People are on Zoom, and if you find somebody annoying, you can just close your computer and have a cup of coffee and try and sort of
there's a lot less autonomy in an orchestra. You don't go off and play your part by yourself and then come together for the occasional meeting like you do in an office, right? You're working together every day.
Exactly. And so there will be many orchestras where the first clarinet player who sits next to the second clarinet player, they've been sitting together for 30 years. You come to work and that person is sitting right there. And you have the two oboists who are sitting two flutists who are sitting right in front of you. They may have been there for 25 years as well. So those 4 people have spent 2.5 decades, 3 decades sitting in those spaces every day for 6 hours a day and in concert. So all the good things about the people around you become wonderful, and you know them backwards. But any little thing, like imagine every time you play the clarinet, you went like that, just whatever. Let's say you just did that with your. After a while, the person next to you is going to find that annoying. So this kind of the friction of being together every day can be enormous. But of course, the reward of being in a collective that demands everything of you and can only really excel if you're giving your best is great too. But as a conductor, you need to be aware of that. You can't only worry about that. You can't only worry about how people are feeling all day. But in order to get the best out of an orchestra, like the best of any team, you need people to be freed up psychologically to be giving their best and to be sort of empowered. So it is part of what you do. But it's an extraordinary. I've used the analogy before. If you were to imagine getting a hockey team on the ice, and how many players are there on a hockey team?
On the ice at one time, or in total? On the ice at one time, there'd be 6, including the goalie. Yeah.
So let's put the other team on as well. So let's say it's 12, and then you put out 12 pucks, and you say, right now just okay. And then you double the size of the team, then you double the size of the team again, and then you add another 2 teams, and you add all of those pucks. That's sort of what's happening in music, in a symphony orchestra. Because when we're all playing at the same time, everybody has a puck and the responsibility for making sure that the pass goes to the next person. They need to be accurate, they need to be in tune, they need to also be aware of where the other person is. But they're like that, they're just firing across the orchestra. You can't see them, but they're there. And when it's going well, it's in complete symbiosis. The pucks are flying around and everybody's kind of in a mind meld. And I'm there for 2 things. One is to facilitate that and to guide us and to get us into the right headspace for it to happen. But if a puck errantly flies off somewhere, to just help reconnect it with the 2 players who had it. So it's difficult to underestimate the intensity of interaction that's occurring in a symphony orchestra.
So a couple of things. First of all, I admire your desire to use Canadian analogies for all of this. This is great. Thank you for that. That's wonderful.
It took me 3 years to stop saying ice hockey.
Right, I know. And you did say soccer earlier.
You're
instead
welcome.
of football. Yeah. Secondly, that almost sounds to me like it makes me think of Cirque du Soleil in a way, right? Where you've got all these people. It's just more evident when it's that kind of acrobatic performance. It's more evident to the audience, I think, how much everyone is relying on each other than it would be when you're listening to the music. But it's probably the same dynamic, right?
Well, you can try this out very easily at home if you have more than a couple of people. You can do it as like an after dinner party event, if we're ever allowed to have dinner parties again, which is to get people going, like, just clap, right? Get everybody clapping in unison and get someone to conduct that, and then get the person who's conducting to speed up a little bit and slow down. And what you need to do is, however many people you are, to keep clapping perfectly in unison. Well, you need to figure out how to clap perfectly in unison together in the first place. That's quite hard, right? That's the kind of nuts and bolts of an orchestra. But then get them all to speed up and slow down exactly in time. So it sounds like one set of hands clapping. Now that's a really rudimentary version of what an orchestra does. But if you get a few people together and try it, you'll see how extraordinarily complex it is. And what it means is you have to have full control of this. But your ears, you need to really, no matter, for every extra person, you need to have an extra set of ears to be zoning in on exactly what they're doing and how they're playing. It's fun.
Sounds amazing and incredibly difficult. How do you manage your time? Because you're a musician, you're a conductor, you're the leader of this organization. As you mentioned, there's so many other responsibilities that go with that. So how do what have you learned to do in terms of managing your time?
Well, the last 6 months have been easier because I've had more time. The thing that's traditionally been really hard is that I was fitting in an awful lot of guest conducting. So when I wasn't with the orchestra here or the Royal Philharmonic, my other orchestra in the UK, and for a couple of years there I had Nuremberg as well. So I was Nuremberg and Ottawa and London as my main orchestras. I was still fitting in guest conducting, which meant that I was traveling all the time, a lot of different time zones, lots of different places, trying to build those relationships with orchestras, that trust. Sometimes just within a couple of rehearsals, you have to build that. But also juggling a huge amount of repertoire. So, we normally have about 80 to 90 minutes worth of repertoire on a program. And very often I'd be doing a couple of programs a week where I needed to know every detail of every one of those minutes very, very well. So it was particularly up to March, very, very intense. And I have to say, when our little boy Sasha came along, it became even more difficult to figure out what to let go. Because for example, being good at my job and sort of also being good as a father and a husband meant for me also fitting in exercise and sport. But if you spend 40 minutes running, that's 40 minutes you're not with your child or with your partner or studying or giving a concert or something else. So, I mean, we all have these problems, right? And that's why you asked the question. And I suppose I became very quick at learning. I'm quite methodical in how I study music. And I think if one has a method, one becomes more and more efficient at it. So it's not sort of random. I don't just kind of like figure out a score as I go along. I have a very specific way of preparing. which helps me. I'm also very structured in the way that I plan. So if I have a lot coming up, I will literally make a learning calendar and a study calendar that sometimes breaks down into hours a day of how many hours, the minimum I will require in order to get this to the level that I think I need. And sometimes sticking to that plan is difficult, but I find making the plan in stressful times very, very helpful indeed.
So you're very methodical about it then, in terms of saying, if I've got to learn these pieces of music over a period of time, I'm going to map out where I need to be a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, that sort of thing. Yeah.
I think it's very difficult for anybody in any industry to balance a lot of responsibilities without actually having quite a lot of structure in it. I'm quite good at compartmentalizing. Sometimes that's one of the things I try and work on, is when I find it deadly for everything. When I carry, for example, when I feel like I haven't done enough work and then I go into a family context, I'm not in my work and I'm not with my family. And that's one of the things about myself that I criticize a lot, and I try to change when I can, is accepting I am now with my family, be with my family. Do you know what I mean?
It's so hard to do though.
Yeah, but I have moments where that happens, and they're ever fewer because I am working on it hard. But I think that's important. And again, to come back to what I said at the beginning of our conversation, the search for self. My profession is my passion, and it is my vocation, and it is so fundamentally a part of me that simply saying it's a means to an end and I shouldn't worry about it too much is impossible. At the same time, one needs to say, what is the point of it? Right? If it eats into my time with my child, which is never going to come back again, why am I doing that? And you need to have good reasons for doing it. And I do sometimes, and I know, for example, that my father went through very similar experiences, and there were many, many, many weeks when he was absent, away on tour. And at least as far as I can tell, that didn't undermine our relationship. Quite the opposite. I was always so excited that he'd come home, and I'm sure I missed him when he was away, and I missed out on things. But anyway, it's part of something that I do ask myself every day, is what is the right balance, and really it's a question of then establishing priorities, reasons for doing things. And currently, touch wood, I feel relatively comfortable in my skin that I've got the balance right, but you never know.
Yeah. You mentioned that search for self. Can you talk more about that and how you go about it? Are there things that you employ? Are there things that you've read about that? Are there, I know some people use meditation.
I don't want to sound like I'm not a sort of in any way into the sort of mindfulness guru stuff or self-help. I don't mean it like that. I mean it more in that that sense of know thyself. I mean, it is so true. Again, to tie up something that I mentioned earlier, going back to the Greeks and before, the wisdoms that are deep in the writings of so many cultures. An area that I've always been very drawn to, I say always, particularly in the last decade or two, is behavioral psychology, because our relationship with so many things is defined through that, if not exclusively, right? And behavioral genetics as well. I read a very interesting book recently called Blueprint, which is about that, and from Daniel Kahneman to Nassim Taleb to all those authors, and even if it's in the area with Taleb of economics or just the way decisions are made, the way we think, the way our minds filter the world, the way we interact with the what's happening around us is fundamental, and our relationship through that to our family, to religion, to philosophy, to our jobs, to everything else is it's seen through that spectrum, that's seen through that lens. Yeah. So I found behavioral psychology very interesting, and I tend to sort of move between reading behavioral psychological books, or books about behavioral psychology, and philosophy. I mean, a book which I sort of reread every couple of years is The History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. And as the name gives away, it's a history of Western philosophy. So it's by no means a history of all philosophies, and there's so much more to be learned. But that book, I always find it incredibly rewarding, because, like I keep on referring to, there are very, very few ideas that are genuinely new that we grapple with. I mean, there's inventions and technological developments and scientific advancements which are genuinely new. They're built on, of course, the architecture of what came previously. But when we think about politics and interpersonal relations and then the search for self, there's very little that's new. And so I tend to find solace in those books, and wisdom, but also just trying to think,
Yeah. Well, even the fact that you are aware of that dynamic, that when you leave your work and it's incomplete. And I've experienced this thousands of times, where you step away from your work because you have to, but it's not complete, and you go over to do something else, and you realize in the middle of it that you're not fully committed to it because the work is still bothering you. Even that awareness is really powerful, right?
It's important. Yeah. I agree. And I do. Yeah. I find, and it comes again back to the question you asked about solitude or social gathering. It's very rare, but very important to find moments to think, I find. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about reading, is that it's sometimes not the reading itself, but the places it leads you to think. And I think that's why reading still feels a little distinct from watching movies and stuff. I mean, I'm a big fan of movies and documentaries. It packs so much information into such a short space of time. You can learn so much by watching a 1-hour documentary, and you could take the equivalent time to read a book, and you wouldn't get half as much information. But on the other hand, the time one spends when an interesting concept comes up in a book, or a concept that leads you in your thoughts to something else, sometimes those 30 seconds or 2 minutes or 5 minutes of just sitting and thinking can be as rewarding as a kind of mini break, and that's something I worry about sometimes, that I don't fit enough time in my life anymore to just be in a sort of thoughtful state. It's quite often doing. But I think if, maybe that's a mistake that you asked me about mistakes, is that I don't make enough time to just sit and think.
You'll have to become a slower runner, and then you'll have more time to think. Do the 10K in an hour instead of 4. Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. It's been fascinating to hear your insights into so many things, especially music, and also the way you approach your role as a conductor and a musical director. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, my great pleasure. It was a really thought-provoking interview. I'm going to go away and think about everything you've asked me.
Wow, I could listen to Alexander Shelley talk about just about anything. That was fascinating for me. I really learned a lot from hearing those perspectives on leadership, on recruiting, on preparation, on how there's no room for pretending. And it was so heartwarming as well to hear him talk about his son and the time that they've spent together during the pandemic. So once again, thank you very much to Alexander Shelley for joining us on Digging Deep. If you enjoyed this episode, please review it. Please share it with others. That's going to help us produce more great episodes. And if you want to keep digging deep into topics and lessons like this, or see the show notes, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, or read my blog, please go to letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. Thank you for listening.